Welcome, class, to Chapter 11. This is going to be about effective learning environments and classroom management. As usual, here's our vocabulary. I want to remind you of the optional vocabulary assignment. It's coming up soon. You should be able to use the ideas we discuss in this lecture on a variety of principles of classroom and behavior management to create effective learning environments in which students learn. So here's some of the questions we're going to be answering today. What are effective learning environments? What's the impact of time on learning? What are some practices and strategies for effective classroom management? Touch a little bit about applied behavior analysis and how can you address serious behavior problems. So first of all, what do we mean by an effective learning environment? Well, creating effective learning environments involves strategies that teachers use to maintain appropriate behavior and respond to misbehavior in the classroom. Keeping students engaged and interested and showing enthusiasm are important in preventing misbehavior. Creating an effective learning environment is a matter of knowing a set of techniques that teachers can learn and apply. And these techniques might be different for everyone. I think of it as a toolbox. Each teacher develops a set of tools that work for him or her over the years. So first, a couple of definitions. Allocated time is the time available for instruction. And we know that there are a lot of things that take away from allocated time. For those of you who taught, you know what I'm talking about, interruptions for assemblies, for example, weather-related issues where the schools close. But we can do things to maximize allocated time. That is time that students have to learn. We can get started on time and finish on time. We can prevent interruptions sometimes, not always, but sometimes. Certainly, we can develop procedures to handle routines in our classrooms smoothly and quickly. And here's a big one. We want to minimize time spent on discipline. This doesn't mean that we never have to do discipline. It means we want to make it so that it doesn't interfere with instruction. So this is an interesting chart from the textbook. It shows that out of the school day, the average student gets about 60% of the total scheduled time actually spent learning on instruction. Other things interfere, such as non-instructional activities, announcement, passing materials, standardized tests, school events, and distractions where the students are distracted. So a lot of our time on instruction is taken away. So we want to really maximize that time on instruction. Engaged time means the time that they actually spend on task or the time the individual students are working. And we must really protect time on task or engaged time. So how do you get started? Well, it's all about doing things efficiently, smoothly, and minimizing misbehavior and other disruptions. So the first thing in the beginning of the year is you're going to think about your classroom rules and procedures. You're going to start the year properly and actually train the students on your procedures. They should be presented clearly and explicitly to students. They can even be rehearsed. You might say, okay, now we're going to rehearse how to line up or how we're going to be dismissed. Consequences for breaking the rules or procedures should be presented explicitly to students. Classroom rules should be applied promptly and fairly. There's nothing worse than a teacher who plays favorites, and students quickly figure this out, and the rules come to mean very little in that classroom. Class rules should protect engaged time. So one of the first management-related tasks is the setting of class rules, and these principles should govern the process. First, class rules should be few in number. You shouldn't have 20 rules because Most of them can be collapsed into three or four. I mean, if you think about the big overarching ones, are things like show respect for yourself and others, um, keep your hands and feet to yourself, that kind of thing. They should make sense and they should be seen as fair by students. You don't want a rule that is just a rule for a rule's sake. And you need to explain as you're discussing with students the reason behind the rule. Why do we have a rule that says respect others? And what does that mean? Does it mean not call out during classroom discussion? Does it mean not say denigrating things about other students? What does it mean? So classrooms should be clearly explained and deliberately taught to students. Consequences should also be designated. You say to the students, here is the rule. Here's what happens if you break the rule the first time. Here is what happens if you break it the second time. Make sure that you are ready and willing to follow through on consequences because there's nothing worse than saying there's a rule and here's the consequence and not be willing to implement that. Some teachers find it effective to allow students to have input into the rules. So rather than posting a list of rules on the first day, some teachers say, okay, we're going to generate the rules together. That's very effective actually in elementary level. In adolescence, where you are, it's a little bit harder to do because you have so many periods and you can't have different rules throughout the day. So what do we mean by classroom management? Classroom management are the methods used to organize classroom activities, instruction, physical structure, and other features to make effective use of time to create a happy and productive learning environment and to minimize behavior problems and other disruptions. So it's not just about setting rules and discipline, it's about all of those routines you have to make your classroom a really high functioning place. It includes things like how do we pass out papers? What do I do if I have papers without names on them? What do I do if I have students who show up with no supplies? So the more you can think about these things and plan for them ahead of time, the more smoothly your classroom will run. Discipline is a part of classroom management, but it's not all of it, as I said. Discipline consists of the methods to prevent behavior problems and to respond to existing behavior problems so as to reduce their occurrence in the future. Out of all the subjects I think we cover, I think classroom management and discipline are two of the ones that most strike fear into new teachers' hearts. All I can say is it's something that you learn over time, and it's a process of trial and error, and it will get easier. There are a number of strategies you can use to maximize engaged time or time on task. As we said, apply a limited number of rules consistently and fairly. Teach engaging lessons. If you just lecture and use worksheets day after day, um, you're likely to have more misbehavior in your class as students' attention wanders or gets bored. But if you're doing a simulation or you're doing a learning project, students are much more likely to be engaged. One of the big areas that beginning teachers run into trouble is during transitions. So when you want, for example, the students to go into small group work, from whole class discussion to small group work, there has to be a process to do that. When you want students to exit the classroom, there has to be a process to do that. So these transition times, it's important to think what transitions will occur in your classroom and how will you get students to move smoothly from one to another. Well, I found that the use of signals helps a lot. So, for example, uh, flashing the lights, it's time now to move into small group work, can be a signal that this period of transition is about to begin. But it's also important to tell students the exact steps you want them to follow in advance. So, for example, boys and girls, we're about to move into small group work. When I flash the lights, I would like you to collect your textbook and notebook, remember your pen, and move to the group to which you've been assigned quietly. I'm going to give us 30 seconds, at which time I will flash the lights again, and at that time you should be in your group. And then have everyone make Flash the light and have everybody make transitions at once. You don't have to use flashing the light. Some teachers count. Some teachers do a countdown. Some teachers snap their fingers. But there has to be a signal. There has to be the telling of the students in advance, and there has to be a way to close off the transition period. Another strategy is to maintain group focus during instruction. And the way we do this is to use techniques that involve the whole class. So instead of calling on one person at a time and never calling on the whole group, sometimes you're going to use choral responses. Okay, everybody, call out this answer, for example. Or whiteboards are particularly effective. You might buy some, they're available on Amazon, and I found them very, very useful. All right, everyone, write an answer on the whiteboard. What do you think the answer to this math problem is? Clickers work as well as doing what we call group alerting. So what do we mean by group alerting? Group alerting is questioning strategies that encourage students to pay attention during lectures. So listen to the way this question is set up. You state the question first and reveal who you will call on only at the end. So, class, what is the second stage of mitosis? Pause, 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 pause. Amy? So instead of saying, Amy, what's the second stage of mitosis? You put the name at the end. And the reason for this is you've alerted the group that anybody could be called on. And so everyone's thinking of the answer. No one knows who's going to get called on. And then finally, you call on a student. It's also asking students about previous answers, such as, what did Amy just say was the second stage of mitosis? John? So you hold the name until the end. You ask students to reiterate, and that keeps the group alert. You can also use nonverbal cues to manage classroom misbehavior, and usually this is minor misbehavior. But a number of people who are experienced will likely recognize that you can make eye contact with the student. As a matter of fact, I wear glasses, and a lot of times I would develop a teacher look where I would just look over my glasses at a student and they would know that my focus is on them. And I didn't have to disrupt my lesson. It was a private communication, even though everyone saw it between myself and the student. And so usually that would stop chatting or minor things like that. You can also move close to a student who is misbehaving. Sometimes you don't even need to do anything else, but just go stand by that student. And finally, a light hand on the student's shoulder is effective. Now, in this day and age of, we have to be concerned about touching students. So check with your principal or your school district about what the district's policy is on this strategy. The easiest behavior problems to deal with are those that never occur in the first place. So how do you prevent misbehavior in your classroom? Well, you can settle students down. That's the first thing. So have a routine when they come into the class for the first 5 minutes that they've got to get seated, they've got to do something. I used to put something called a bell ringer up on the board, and they had to get out a notebook and they had to consider the bell ringer and start. If you don't have this introductory procedure, it's much harder to settle them down. You can deal with problem students. So after the first week, you're going to know who your problem students are in terms of misbehavior. So move them to the front of the room, isolate them from other people that they're likely to engage with so that they can focus better. Present interesting and lively lessons that can be engaging, as we talked about. Big one I found is you've got to have supplies handy. Now I know some teachers balk at this because they think students should have to bring things from home and show responsibility, and that is true. But I try to think about the students whose parents either can't afford supplies or are your students probably aren't driving, so the students can't go out themselves to get their own supplies. So I would just use PTA funds or whatever I could scrape together, and I would have pencils and paper in the back of the room. And most students did not abuse it. There were students who would show up without supplies though. And I guess the question you want to ask yourself is, do you want to stop the class for 10 minutes and embarrass the student by lecturing him about the necessity to bring supplies, or do you just want to get started with instruction? And I wanted to get started with instruction. Have an orderly procedure for handing in assignments. So whether it's someone in the group collects the assignments and brings them to you, or you have students pass papers forward, think in advance about how the assignments will be handed in. Keep all students busy on meaningful tasks. So this is particularly important for students who finish early. You might have some advanced students who finish early and then are likely to get into trouble if you don't have something else for them to do. So what some teachers will do is they'll have a backup assignment ready, or they'll say you can get started on homework, or they might have a center to go to where students who are finished can get something to do or explore. Use other effective techniques of basic classroom management, which we'll talk about a little more. And again, see students as human beings. We tend to look at the students who are causing problems as just difficult children. And they could be, but try to remember that they are somebody's son or somebody's daughter and somebody loves them and treat them humanely. The big thing, I think, is to let students know that you're on their side and want them to succeed. Praise students when they exhibit good behavior. Use it to subtly point out inappropriate behavior. So if you have one student in the classroom who's not complying with an instruction, instead of pointing him or her out, point out their neighbors that are doing it. Oh, I really like the way Sally is collecting the papers for that group. I appreciate this group's responsiveness. And that points out inappropriate behavior without embarrassing anyone. Give brief verbal reminders when necessary. So here's the key to this. You don't want to say over and over like a broken record what's what's going wrong. Uh, Remember, Sally, I need you to do one more problem before you turn your paper in. Sally, you don't want to say, Sally, have you not done that problem? Sally, when are you going to get to work on that problem? One or two brief reminders. Apply consequences, as we said, consistently and fairly. You don't want to come down harshly on the misbehaving student and look at Sally, who may not be doing well that day in terms of behavior, and say, well, Sally usually behaves. You got to apply all consequences consistently. Consequences should be reasonable, doable, and a little unpleasant, but not something that's horrendous. You don't want to bring out a nuclear bomb for, a minor misdeed or misfraction. Sometimes you have more serious behaviors in the classroom. This is where applied behavior analysis comes in, and I know you're going to get this in other courses. So this is going to, or maybe you've already had it. So this is going to be just a brief overview. ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, is the application of behavioral learning principles to understand and change classroom behavior. And it comes out of the work of Skinner's operant condition, applying punishments and rewards. There are 3 steps. You're going to, once you know that the student is misbehaving, you're going to establish a baseline of frequency for the number of misbehaviors. You're going to select reinforcers for good behavior and criteria for reinforcement, and punishers and criteria for punishment for poor behavior. And we want to try to use punishment sparingly. It's not that we never use it. If reinforcement is effective, we want to focus on that. If reinforcement is not effective, we focus a little bit on that. It employs behavior modification or a systematic application of antecedents and consequences to change behavior. In other words, if you do this, this consequence will follow. And we try to get the student to understand that and modify his or her behavior as a consequence. Some good reinforcers for the classroom are praise. Many students respond to praise. Proximity can be a reinforcer if that's something that the student is looking for your attention, then coming and standing by them can be a reinforcer. Nonverbal expressions like smiles and thumbs up. And finally, preferred activities. So if students really want 10 minutes of art time, that could be a reinforcer, free art time. Um, Pizza parties, although these tend to, encourage external locus of controls. These are all reinforcers. Punishers. These are things that are negative, if you recall from your Skinner chapter. These are negative things that decrease misbehavior. So nonverbal cues like the stern look over the glasses, thumbs down, isolating students. And we want to use this briefly, but sometimes you'll walk in the classroom and you'll see a student sitting at a desk apart from the other students. And this might be during a brief period to try to calm that student down. Just like proximity can be a reinforcer if the student finds it pleasant, proximity can be a punisher if he doesn't find it pleasant. So if he doesn't want the attention of the teacher coming and standing by him, can be a type of punishment. Loss of preferred activities. So again, rewards. Rewarding someone means giving them something pleasant that they consider pleasant. But if you say, okay, well, we're not going to do recess today, or we're not going to have this pleasurable thing, that's a punishment. And finally, for younger students, timeout can be a punisher. So what you want to do is follow the principle of least intervention. And that means using the simplest methods that will work. You don't start off by using a nuclear bomb on a small infraction. So you start off with something, if it's a small infraction, you start off with something small. If the infractions continue or get more serious, you start out with, you ratchet it up so that you're using more and more serious interventions. Your main goal in dealing with routine misbehavior is to do so in a way that is both effective and avoids unnecessarily disrupting the lesson. If at all possible, try to get the lesson to go on while the behaviors problems are dealt with. So what you don't want is you don't want to shut the entire class down and deal for 10 minutes with a student misbehavior, because then everybody loses 10 minutes of instructional time. Sometimes you're going to get into dire situations where that's necessary, like if a fight breaks out. But usually we can continue with the lesson and find ways to deal with the disruption. Take, for example, this table. So, first step on all misbehavior is to prevent it. And we talked about ways to prevent it: displaying enthusiasm, varying your activity, keep students interested. But if it does occur and it's minor, you can use non-verbal cues such as frowning and looks over your glasses, hands on the shoulder. If it continues, what you try to do is you praise the correct behavior that is incompatible with the misbehavior. So if, for example, if a student is having trouble turning things in on time, and she does, you say, I hear you completed your science project on time for the judging. That's great. So look for instances in the student's behavior where they're doing well and praise that. If the student's having trouble sitting in his seat, Benjamin, I really like how you managed to stay in your seat for the entire language block this morning. Behavior that continues, you can praise other students if the student's not doing the behavior. So for example, I see most of you turned your papers in on time today. I really appreciate that. So if the student's having trouble turning his work in on time, the message will be received. Verbal reminders. Tanya, please turn in your paper next on time would be the next step. And repeated reminders, again, not sounding like a broken record. Tanya, it's important to turn in your paper on time, maybe once or twice reminding. And then finally, step 7, consequences. Uh, this would be in alignment with your rules that you've posted. So Tanya might spend 10 minutes after class starting on the next paper. And there would be levels of consequences after that, calling home, for example. So the point of um, the least intervention would be you start with something, just prevention, and you ratchet it up as the behavior is repeated or becomes more serious. So what are the big ideas in this lecture? First, we must preserve time on task or engage time. We must set few rules but enforce them consistently. We try to prevent misbehavior before it starts by developing engaging lessons and using nonverbal cues and group alerting. We have procedures for classroom routines such as transitions and handing out papers and having supplies ready and leaving class and entering class and more. And finally, we use the principle of least intervention when managing classroom behavior, starting small, using reinforcers and punishers, and then as the behavior continues, increasing the level of what we do. So I hope this has been a little bit about classroom management, giving you something to think about. Everybody have a great week.